All right, so then let's begin creating engagement pathways. So in this micro lesson, we are going to talk about creating equivalent options. Again, many of you were really curious about that, how to use different tools to support student engagement, how we can create more opportunities for engagement, and how we can clarify our instructions for how students will engage with each other, especially if it's over space, over time, or both. And in these flexible course environments, the purpose for this micro lesson is really to key in on the fact that students need more support and direction when they're in these flexible course environments. There's less certainty because they haven't experienced it before, or they're trying different modalities on different days. And so we'll explore different strategies and then we'll complete an activity. So it's helpful to think about what are the types of activities that we normally see in the classrooms that we're used to, right? And so we can imagine putting students in pairs for different activities. Raise your hand in the chat, or put a Y for yes or an N for no if you've used something called a think, pair, share with your students, or something like it, where you have students pair up to discuss results from clickers. Looks like almost everybody. I would say 99.9%. All right, so then you can imagine. Oh, great. Thank you, Shady, for turning on the captioning. I forgot that. You can imagine that the think, pair, share, or any type of pair activities in a classroom just involves students turning to a neighbor. And that's something you can do when you're in a fixed seating classroom, like a raked floor with stadium seats that are bolted down, or it could be something where the students can move the chairs around. Either way, in a hybrid class, students still do paired activities, either in person and maybe continue it online, or in some cases, they might start a hybrid activity in the online discussion or something like that, and then bring it back into the classroom later. In remote classes, when students like you all right now are participating remotely, you might move students into breakout rooms of 2 or 3 students each. And asynchronously, you can ask students to work in pairs, or you can allow students to schedule synchronous meetings outside of the class time. If they are in the same time zone, if they have similar work demands or demands at home, then they might be able to find a time when they can check in with each other. Similarly, for small groups in a classroom, you might have students move into pods. In a hybrid class, you might conduct those small group activities and then continue them online, either synchronously or asynchronously. In a remote class, you might increase the size of those breakout rooms, and asynchronously, you might have those students work in groups using the group functionality for the learning management system. And then in some cases, we have the whole class participate in some sort of activity, right? So we have maybe students participating in a large group activity. Sometimes it's with technology. I brought up clickers earlier, or Poll Everywhere, which is something you can use on any device. Having students begin large class activities in person and continue them online. Remote students might use tools in the video conference space, like raise your hand, use the chat, or annotation, where you can ask people to draw on the screen from their desktop. And last but not least, asynchronously, you might have students use a learning management system tool like a discussion forum, or as we've been doing, you might have them use a third-party tool like Slack or Pronto, or one of those tools that integrate with your learning management system. So those are some typical interactions. And now let's take a look at what they might look like in a flexible environment. So we can maybe think about those 3 types of activities: pairs, small groups, and whole class activities for assignments and discussions. So for assignments, pairs might be based on location. Students in the classroom pair up, students who are remote might pair up, students who are asynchronous might pair up. So that way they can find someone who's similar to them, similar circumstances. And in other cases, you might have them paired based on different groups that are made ahead of time. There's a strategy that we'll talk about later called remote buddies, where students pair up with someone for the entire semester. And that remote buddy is their connection to the physical classroom. Some student who knows they're going to be in the physical classroom every time, and some student who knows they're going to be remote every time can buddy up. And then that student can text their in-class buddy and say, hey, can you ask them to repeat that? Or can you ask the teacher why meiosis is spelled so strangely? M-E-I-E-O-S. So that buddy system we'll talk about in more detail in a second, but it's another way to have students work in pairs. And similarly, in a discussion, it could be based on signups, where they can schedule their own meetings. And so in the past, what I've done is I've used a Google form, and I ask students to identify the times of day that they could have a Zoom meeting with a classmate. And then I have students find each other that way. And it's worked pretty well. So you can see how this works. For flexible interactions, we're thinking through the modalities that students are following or participating in our class, whether it be in person, remote, or on your own asynchronously, and figuring out, well, how can we construct ways for them to work with other people? Obviously, in-person students and asynchronous students, it's going to be harder for them to work together. And so you want to think through how to create equivalent experiences, but also not make it seem like, okay, the in-person students don't get to do anything in the class because we have to wait for the asynchronous students to catch up. And so it's just a function of thinking through all the permutations. Lolita asks about recommendations for large class sizes. Well, so my own class is 50 to 100 students, depending on the semester. Although it's not a flexible class, I do use a number of these strategies. And so again, if you're thinking that you're going to split up your students in different ways, Lalita, if you're going to give students choice to show up to class or not, or if you're going to break them into cohorts to reduce the number of students in the room, like they are doing in certain universities around the country, then you would probably pick some of these strategies where maybe the in-person students form groups, the online students who are remote on Zoom get put into breakouts, and then the asynchronous students get put into groups as well. And they could be different groups every class meeting, because again, depending on the amount of flexibility you're providing, some students may be in person today and asynchronous tomorrow. And so allowing some flexibility, no pun intended, for those students to join different groups in each circumstance. Faith wants to know about tips for student outliers who don't respond to quizzes about availability. Yes, those students are harder to track down. And so I usually go the route of sending personal messages. And I have found in my experience, when I changed the title of my emails from a more administrative need an answer or reply required, I've changed it to "Are you okay?" question mark in the title of the email. And then I say, hey, I'm just checking in. We haven't heard from you. We need to know if you're able to get on the phone with me so that we can talk through how I can help you catch up. A lot of people respond back. I used to get about a 10% response rate with the more administrative emails. I get probably about 2/3, almost 70% response rate with the "Are you okay?" Because students appreciate that I'm thinking about them as humans first and students second. And we will need to consider that as we go through this whole flexible course experience, because students are, in fact, humans. If you have any robots in your class, then I apologize to them. All right, so when we think about the equivalent pathways, sometimes it may be possible for us to just save it. Okay, everybody, we're going to do this activity asynchronously. That way, everybody has a level playing field. We're all going to do it the same way. In some cases, you may use the same environment for all modalities. Like, okay, everybody, if you're in person, buddy up with someone who has a device. If you're online, you have a device already. And if you're watching the recording, then you have a device too. We're all going to use Slack for this activity. And so I want you to go in and use hashtag activity1 and put your answer to this prompt. And so that Slack channel is now going to capture live stream stuff from the classroom, live stream stuff from Zoom, but using Slack, and then the asynchronous stuff as well. It's all going to be captured in one place. Similarly, you could use a discussion forum, which isn't real time. It doesn't reload or refresh the page, but it does allow you to use one environment for everyone. Janae is asking about reducing the feelings of faculty overwhelm in managing asynchronous chat channels during synchronous class sessions. Why, yes. You just hold on to your hat, Janae, because we've got quite a few strategies for that. One, I am going to do a little preview. If you've heard of Google Jockey, I have created in my brain a new role called Chat Jockey. So that's one strategy, but we'll talk about many. Back to the topic at hand, though, creating equivalent pathways. Another way to work through that is to create a serial activity that builds over time. I know in the last session, we talked about writing, and I know there are a number of writing instructors in the room. Some of you may have activities where students create a story that builds. Let's say, just looking at my video window, I write the first sentence, Malcolm Finney writes the second sentence, Leslie Kennedy writes the third sentence, Lalita Oka writes the fourth sentence, and we are constructing a story together. We are co-creating. So you could create serial activities, whether it's solving a math problem, or writing a piece of fiction, or figuring out how to translate specific verbs from irregular IR stems in Spanish. Whatever your activity, you can create something that builds over time, and students work with what they've been given by the student before them. The last strategy is to start in person and continue it asynchronously. And you may have heard this little memory cue for you. Sometimes I will say, we're going to begin this now together, and then we are going to continue it with our asynchronous friends after the session. And so those types of verbal cues let the asynchronous students know that they are going to watch the beginning of the discussion and participate once we get going. You probably also saw some strategies that I have used where I take ideas from the chat that the asynchronous students may miss, and I pop those in a Slack channel. I pop those in a discussion forum so they're readily available, and students don't have to look through 5 to 10 pages of chat notes to find those nuggets. And that's why I really like using hashtags in the chat, because it makes it easier to find ideas related to specific parts of your lecture. All right, so what are some challenges that we have when we deal with interaction in flexible course environments? Some in-person students may not bring a device. Some students may have trouble toggling because they're on a smartphone. And interestingly enough, my placeholder text made it through to the video despite being red, Mars is a cold place. But really, that is supposed to talk about how the power in the classroom may not be sufficient. We may need more plugs. Students may bring a device, but it may be low on energy or battery. And if you're like me, when I did my doctoral program at University of San Francisco, their classrooms were in a 150-year-old building that had one plug at the back of the room. And you could imagine in the 3 to 3.5 hour classes for doctoral classes on weekends, everybody was scrambling for those 2 plugs. So if you know that you're possibly going to have power issues, you might want to do things like bring a power strip or tell your students to take turns so that they can save their battery. And again, we'll talk about the idea of a tech scribe in a second. So the other interaction challenges that we might face in a flexible course experience, low audio. If not every classroom is going to be outfitted with microphones for the students in the room, right? So we're going to have to come up with some strategies to address that. And there may be plenty of background noise. So when we talked about putting students in pairs or small groups, it is possible to put remote students with in-person students in, let's say, a Zoom breakout. The challenge will be if the person in the classroom turns on their microphone, the student online is going to hear all the background noise of the other groups talking at the same time. So if you want to reduce that, then you may have to think about pairing or grouping students in the room, students on Zoom, students asynchronous. But those are just challenges that we have to think through as opposed to avoiding altogether. And Janae brings up some good points related to supporting students with disabilities. And so low audio and background chatter is for students who are not only deaf, but hard of hearing. That would definitely be a barrier. And so hopefully they can take advantage of the transcription or captioning services, or possibly use an American Sign Language translator with a spotlight in Zoom, even if they're in the room. If you're projecting the Zoom environment, then the person can possibly see over all the heads. Usually they sit right in front of the translator, but you never know. So I promised it that we would talk about some ways to overcome these challenges. Remote buddies is one that I mentioned earlier. And again, there's a strategy outlined in a LinkedIn article by a colleague of mine that goes into much more detail, and I'll make sure you all get the link to it. We also have what's called a back channel. You can use the chat or some other communication mechanism, a Google Doc, or some way to capture what students are thinking, asking, so that you can allow that to take place and students can get their answers without interrupting the lecture. It's also a good idea to create pause points in your lecture so that you can take advantage of kind of a natural flow and say, everybody, I'm going to answer questions for this small section in just 1 minute. So write your question down and so you don't forget it, and then we'll get to you. The last strategy is something called a tech scribe. And again, for students who don't bring their devices to the in-person classroom, some students will. And so finding volunteers who will be willing to type or submit the contributions from pairs or small groups allows those people to participate without having to have a device. And so that could be for any reason. And then in micro lesson 3.3, we'll describe a similar role called the chat jockey, which I discussed earlier. Lalita mentioned she assigns note-taking activities to groups, which is a great way to help students learn note-taking skills. And we will talk on Thursday about not only note-taking, but collaborative annotation or social reading, which is a way for students to take notes about what they're reading as well as what they're learning in a live session. All right, so how do we write instructions related to interaction to make sure they're absolutely crystal clear? Identify the expectations and make sure that students see no matter what modality they're pursuing, they're going to complete the same work. Making sure students know what the deadlines are, because students are going to be working at different times. And so making sure they know when things are due. I'm also a big fan of including start dates and milestone dates. Tech tutorials. Some students may need help with any special software that you're using. And so making sure there's a video somewhere that they can use to learn how to navigate that tool or use it is helpful. Also letting students know where to find help. And this is very similar to what we talked about last week with the transparent assignment template, right? Making sure that our instructions, not just our syllabus, but our instructions for each activity have everything students need to succeed so that they don't have to go looking around for it. And then last, you may want to have some link to the norms that you and your class invent together around engagement in a flexible course environment and your own intentions. Students will want to know, how often is the teacher going to be checking this forum? How often is the teacher going to be participating in this Slack channel? And so by putting that information in your instructions, I intend to reply to 1 out of every 5 discussion posts. And over the course of the semester, I'm going to make sure that everybody gets an equivalent number of responses from me, the teacher, for equity purposes. Those are types of things that you can put in your instructions and in your syllabus. Last but not least, what are some tools that we can use for multimodal communication? So the announcement tool is a great one. And you have probably noticed that I use it almost every day for this Flexible Course Experience Institute. And for important ones, I'll even say, sorry if this is a repeat, but I'm going to send it by email also, especially at the beginning when students or learners, in this case, the participants of this institute, may not have accepted the invitation to the Canvas course, or some other factor inhibits them getting a learning management system based message. So having that announcement captured in the learning management system, so there's an archive, there's a history, but also sending it by email because it's immediate. Some of those announcements go out later in the day as a digest, depending on your notification settings. But if you need something to get out right away, hey, the test time has changed. Hey, no longer meeting in person this week due to power outage, whatever the case may be. Those email messages are going to go immediately compared to some of the announcements that'll go out on a daily basis. So another strategy is to use the video conference chat and then repurpose it. So the chat obviously is a fantastic tool, easy to use. And so we want to take advantage of it when we can. I already told you my strategy for using hashtags for each of the main topics that you cover as a group. And then you can save the chat at the end of the meeting. That's something that you can ask students to create a summary as an extra credit activity, or you could just copy and paste the chat into a Google Doc to extend the conversation asynchronously. You can combine the strategies that I just mentioned by extending the conversation from a chat summary that students produce rather than a raw chat file that's hard to follow. We talked about other text-based communication tools like Slack and Pronto. There are some downsides from having yet another tool, but on the positive side, it creates one place for all the interaction to take place. And last, media-based tools can help you humanize some of your interactions. And so in earlier sessions, we talked about tools like Flipgrid or Canvas Studio, where you can, or even a screencast tool like Screencast-O-Matic, where you can give feedback to students using a screencast instead of text, so that they know what you're thinking about their work. And again, there's small amount of literature out there that shows that students respond more favorably to video-based feedback than they do to text. But I'm not going to hang my hat on the 2 articles that I found. All right, so we've been listening to me for quite some time. The activity that we're going to do for micro lesson 3.1 is to continue on with our backward design worksheet. In the first session, we worked through our outcomes and determined how can we make them structured so they increase the flexibility of our course. And then in module 2, we did the same thing, but with assessment strategies. How do we modify our assessments so that we can maximize flexibility? So in this session, we are going to talk through how we can modify our activities in our class, whether they be ways for students to engage with one another or just with the content or with us. And I'll give you, let's say, 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll hop back in and start another micro lesson. I'll keep answering questions in the chat while you all work. And the first one I see is from Faith. What about Panopto? So Panopto is another video-based tool. I have used it, but it's usually in conjunction with other tools. So I don't know the abilities it has related to creating videos from scratch. But it sounds like Janae is going to jump in and help me there, saying that Panopto could work well to create screencasts. They have a built-in video recorder. Perfect. So yeah, there's a number of lecture capture and screencast tools. Camtasia is another one, if your campus provides that. TechSmith, Relay. There are quite a few out there. Faith preferences sometimes may relate to how expensive they are or how easy they are to use. And if you're already familiar with things like Zoom, there's no reason why you couldn't create a screencast on Zoom. Give you about 1 more minute to think through maybe one activity you use in your class and how you can modify it so it's more flexible or multimodal. And I'm seeing a lot of great comments in the chat around assigning people to be a chat jockey instead of looking for recruits, just as long as you are not creating an equity barrier for people who might not have a device, that should be fine. I like William's idea of the delayed chat to give students time to think and let them know that everybody should participate. Some people use a similar technique called Chatterfall, where they tell everybody to type their message, but don't click submit until 1 minute expires, and then everybody clicks submit at the same time, and it looks like a waterfall, but with chat comments. It is harder to read, but then you have time, as William said, to go back and review what all your colleagues have said. Janae brings up a good point about making sure you check to see what your campus already supports. Faith, I will put together a completed backward design worksheet and post it. All right. So with that, I'm hopeful that some of you will post some ideas in the chat of what you're going to change in order to create more flexible engagement activities in your class. I'm going to press stop recording for a moment as we shift to the next micro lesson.